A man sits in his driveway long after the engine has gone silent. The house is dark. No one is waiting behind the front door. His phone hasn't buzzed in hours, and the quiet feels heavier than exhaustion. It isn't dramatic. It isn't sudden. It's the kind of silence that arrives one ordinary evening and slowly becomes a way of life. What makes this moment so dangerous is that loneliness rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as independence, routine, or just needing some space. By the time a man realizes something has changed, the change has often been happening for years. There are 4 profound ways loneliness reshapes a man after 40. Not only how he thinks, but how he feels, connects, remembers, and even sees himself. And the first transformation is the one almost nobody notices. Most people imagine loneliness as the absence of company. Psychology suggests something deeper. It is the absence of meaningful emotional exchange. In early adulthood, conversations with a partner, close friends, children, or trusted colleagues constantly reflect parts of our inner world back to us. We explain frustrations, celebrate victories, and hear perspectives that challenge our assumptions. These ordinary interactions quietly regulate emotional health. When those exchanges disappear, something subtle begins to happen. A man doesn't necessarily become more emotional. He often becomes less aware of what he's feeling at all. Researchers studying chronic loneliness have found that prolonged social isolation changes the way people interpret emotional signals, making neutral situations seem more threatening and reducing sensitivity to positive social cues. The brain starts conserving emotional energy, but that protection comes at a cost. This is why many men after 40 stop saying, "I'm lonely," and instead say, "I'm just tired. People annoy me," or "I don't need anyone." The feeling has been translated into something easier to carry. But emotional numbness isn't emotional strength. It's often a survival strategy. The tragedy is that survival strategies, when practiced long enough, can become identities. And once a man mistakes emotional distance for who he truly is, the next change begins in ways that are even harder to recognize. Once emotional awareness fades, loneliness starts changing something even more fundamental: perception. Human beings evolved as social creatures. For most of history, being isolated wasn't simply unpleasant. It could be dangerous. Evolutionary psychologists believe that loneliness acts like an internal alarm system, encouraging us to reconnect because survival once depended on belonging to a group. The problem is that when loneliness becomes chronic, the alarm never turns off. Instead of motivating connection, it gradually reshapes how the brain interprets other people. A delayed text feels intentional. A brief conversation seems dismissive. An invitation that never comes confirms a story already taking shape. Maybe people just don't care anymore. Research led by psychologist John Cacioppo, one of the pioneers in loneliness studies, found that prolonged loneliness creates a state of hypervigilance for social threats. The mind becomes remarkably efficient at spotting signs of rejection, even when they aren't actually there. Imagine looking through a window that grows slightly darker every year. The outside world hasn't changed nearly as much as the glass through which you're viewing it. This is why many men over 40 slowly withdraw, without realizing they're reinforcing the very loneliness they hope to escape. They stop calling first. They decline invitations. They convince themselves that staying home is simply more peaceful. At first, it feels like self-protection. Over time, it becomes self-fulfilling. The fewer meaningful interactions a man has, the more unfamiliar connection feels. And what is unfamiliar often begins to feel unsafe, even when it's exactly what he needs. But this isn't where loneliness does its deepest work. Because after it changes how a man sees the world, it quietly begins changing how he sees himself. And that transformation is far more difficult to reverse. Most men don't build their identity by looking inward. They build it through responsibility. Being a husband, a father, a trusted friend, a mentor, a coworker. People rely on. These roles quietly answer a question that rarely gets spoken aloud. Who am I to other people? After 40, those roles often begin to shift. Children grow up. Careers plateau or end. Marriages change, or sometimes disappear altogether. Friends become busy with lives of their own. The calendar grows emptier, but the deeper loss isn't time, it's reflection. Our identity is shaped not only by what we believe about ourselves, but by the relationships that consistently remind us who we've become. Social psychologists have long described the self as something that develops in interaction with others. We don't merely express our character through relationships, we refine it because of them. Without those mirrors, a man can slowly become disconnected from parts of himself he once took for granted. He may stop telling stories because no one asks. Stop pursuing hobbies because there's no one to share them with. Stop making plans because the future feels less inhabited. The result isn't always sadness. Sometimes it's something more unsettling, indifference. Days begin to resemble one another. Milestones pass almost unnoticed. Time accelerates because fewer emotionally significant moments are being created, and memory has little reason to distinguish one week from the next. This helps explain why some men describe their 50s or 60s as feeling as though they disappeared without understanding why. They didn't lose their abilities overnight. They gradually lost the relationships that gave those abilities meaning. And yet, even this isn't the final chapter of loneliness. Because the greatest surprise isn't what loneliness takes away. It's what can happen when a man chooses, even after years of silence, to reconnect with the world again. The most persistent myth about loneliness is that time eventually solves it. In reality, time often strengthens whatever habits already exist. If isolation becomes routine, the brain starts treating it as normal. What once felt temporary begins to feel permanent, not because change is impossible, but because the familiar becomes more comfortable than the unknown. Neuroscience offers a more hopeful perspective. The adult brain remains remarkably adaptable. Through neuroplasticity, it continues to reorganize itself in response to new experiences, new relationships, and repeated behaviors well into later life. This means that the patterns created by loneliness are powerful, but they are not fixed. The first step back is rarely dramatic. It might be accepting an invitation instead of declining it, calling an old friend without waiting for the perfect reason, joining a community built around a genuine interest rather than searching desperately for companionship. These actions seem ordinary, yet they interrupt the cycle that loneliness depends on. What's remarkable is that meaningful connection doesn't simply improve mood. Research consistently links strong social relationships with better cognitive health, lower stress, greater resilience, and even longer life expectancy. The human nervous system is designed not merely to survive alongside others, but to regulate itself through trusted relationships. Perhaps that's why some men experience an unexpected feeling after reconnecting with people they trust. They don't feel like they've become someone new. They feel like they've remembered someone they thought was gone. Because beneath years of silence, disappointment, or emotional distance, identity is rarely destroyed. More often, it has simply been waiting for a conversation, a shared laugh, or an honest moment to awaken it again. And that changes the entire story. Loneliness after 40 doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in quietly, reshaping emotions, perception, identity, and habits until a man can no longer remember when the silence first became familiar. But understanding this process changes something important. It reminds us that loneliness is not a personality. It is not a permanent sentence. It is a human response to prolonged disconnection, one that can begin to heal the moment genuine connection returns. Perhaps the greatest measure of strength isn't learning to need no one. Perhaps it's having the courage to let yourself be seen again. If this story gave you a new way of looking at loneliness, share your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them may realize they're not as alone as they believed. And if you'd like more documentary-style explorations of psychology, relationships, and the inner lives of men, consider subscribing for the next conversation.